conversation, it generated some rethinking of things. So thank you very much for that, and thanks for all of the contributions. And it's my pleasure now to start the afternoon's proceedings by once again asking the Embajadora, Bárbara Montalvo Álvarez, who wanted to ask if she could say some words, so we are happy to oblige. Over to you, Bárbara.
Muchas gracias y un saludo a todos. Arístides, que ha seguido el evento más directamente, me comentó que la jornada de ayer fue muy productiva y muy interesante. Yo en realidad los debo felicitar y los felicito calurosamente. Creo que la respuesta a esta convocatoria virtual de un evento como este, amplio, ha sido muy buena. Y hasta que la pandemia nos lo permita, pues debíamos continuar utilizando estas plataformas digitales para mantener la comunicación. Porque es bueno no parar, no detenerse, a pesar de los inconvenientes y a pesar de las dificultades. Ustedes tienen una cercanía con Cuba, con su historia y el proceso revolucionario cubano. Y ustedes saben cuán importante ha sido el trabajo de la academia para Cuba, y que es algo que estimuló desde el inicio mismo de la revolución Fidel. Y esa visión se ha mantenido porque la academia, insisto, aporta una visión múltiple, diferencias de puntos de vista, de visiones. Y actualmente nuestro gobierno está haciendo un gran esfuerzo, un esfuerzo muy consistente, diría yo, para que se pueda incrementar la contribución de la ciencia y de la investigación a la gestión gubernamental. Y el enfrentamiento al COVID-19 nos demostró, yo creo, cuán valiosa es esta integración y cómo todos los esfuerzos podían contribuir desde diferentes ramas del conocimiento humano y no solamente desde el punto de vista de las ciencias médicas o biotecnológicas, sino en sus aspectos ciencias sociales, ciencias económicas. Y si ustedes ven la composición del grupo nacional que en Cuba dirige desde el inicio el enfrentamiento a la COVID, ustedes verán que ahí hay matemáticos, sociólogos, economistas y, por supuesto, representantes de la asistencia médica y de las ciencias médicas y biotecnológicas. Así que es algo muy alentador que un fórum de esta naturaleza, y espero por alguna ayuda a memoria que ustedes elaboren, algún documento que me permita a mí conocer más estrechamente lo que se ha planteado aquí. Yo solamente los interrumpo brevemente porque me quería despedir. Les deseo de verdad muchos éxitos en sus respectivas actividades y desde luego muy particularmente en lo que concierne al trabajo del centro y a la organización de futuros foros. Donde quiera que ustedes estén, por favor, cuídense mucho, todavía hay que cuidarse, y creo que todos coincidirán conmigo en que extienda un saludo muy especial y reitere mi gratitud a Tony y a Pat por el empeño y el esfuerzo que han puesto para que el foro sea el éxito que ya yo creo que es. Un abrazo a todos.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Y a ustedes también, muchas gracias por tu presencia.
Ya. Gracias a los dos y bueno, nos importa mucho su presencia aquí. Okay.
Perfecto. Bueno, yo creo que vamos a abrir pronto. We're going to open the session today of papers. So we had a wonderful film screening this morning and a lot of discussion to do with that. Remember, the film is still available to watch on Vimeo. And there are a couple of people who've been saying that they can't access the resources that we've posted on the files on Teams. We're all learning how to use this, so please don't worry. We will find ways to make all of this accessible to you once the conference is over. Okay. Actually, just before we start with the papers, and we'll be starting with our panel on cultural intellectual history, I just wanted to say a couple of words. Well, Tony's going to speak first, and I'm going to speak after that, but literally one sentence each. So over to you.
My one sentence is, it's a great pleasure that we're actually running this conference, not least because it's the last one that I'm going to be actually organising. I'll still be coming along to the conferences afterwards and helping Pa with in any way possible, certainly not technically. But I'm really glad that it actually took place. I was beginning to feel that, a bit like my last lecture to my students, that actually turned out not to be a lecture but was online, that was going to happen also with this. So I'm glad that you all turned up. Many thanks.
And just to say that I will be taking over the Las Riendas, the reins of the Cuba Research Fund and the Center for Research on Cuba as of the end of September. Obviously, there'll be a pretty fluid handover from Tony because there will. And I was a founding member of the forum, so I understand what the spirit of the forum is, and I really hope to honour that in the future and do it in a slightly different way. We all put our imprint on these things. But the first thing I'll be doing is asking all of the members here in Cuba and in other places what else you'd like to see happen with the centre and with the forum. So please expect to hear from me. Okay, I think we're going to move on to our papers. And so we have Isabel Story and Clayfield. They have been very smart and have pre-recorded their presentation, PowerPoint and video. So we'll play that in a second. And then Valeria, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
excellent. And Valeria, how is your internet connection? Would you like me to play the PowerPoint and you can do it live, or do you want to play?
Let's play the video better because as I told you, my Wi-Fi connection isn't great and image sometimes fails, so I prefer the video.
No problem. And then you'll be available to answer questions afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah? Excellent. And then we have Luis Boffill, who has sent a text and an audio file after that. So as usual, bear with me. We will get all of these things done in time. But the first one is Isabel Story and Anna Clayfield, Creating Culture and Combatientes, Fostering Unity in Cuba in the 1980s. So please bear with me.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for listening to our presentation today. Izzy and I will be talking together about a research project that we're currently working on, which looks at magazine cover art in Cuba. And the underpinning idea for the project is that cover art, which is an often overlooked medium, can function as both a mirror and as a visual shorthand for wider changes that have occurred in the revolutionary project since 1959. At the same time, we also argued that it has the potential to tell a slightly different story to what appears inside the magazine and to official narratives more broadly. So the main publications we've been focusing on so far are Cuba's oldest general interest magazine, Bohemia, and Verde Olivo, which is the official magazine, Revolucionarias, or the FAD. While the intention of our overall project is to encompass images from across the 6 decades of the revolution in power, today we're just going to offer a very brief overview of the 1980s.
Okay.
I believe that this is a decade in which you can see a very marked shift in cover art design for reasons which I'll discuss later. So before I look at some examples then from the 1980s, I'll first hand over to Izzy, who will explain a little bit about how cover art fits into the wider trajectory of Cuban visual art since 1959.
So from about the mid-1960s, an art form which had been totally formed within the revolution emerged. This form was graphic design, and in particular, it favoured the poster as its key medium of expression. It was an emerging area that was quickly supported and cherished for its ability to respond rapidly to events as they occurred, and for making the lack of creative resources into a virtue for its expression. The primary medium of this new wave of graphic design was also reflective of ideas about culture within the revolution. The poster is inherently public and deeply accessible. It's a good poster. And while it could be accessed by those with limited literacy or limited visual literacy, it was also complex and spoke to those informed in global arts trends. While poster and graphic design consolidated their positions within revolutionary creation in the 1970s as well. In the first report on cultural creation in Cuba for UNESCO, written in 1972, the aesthetic, mobilizing, Cuban and non-profit aims were emphasized. According to the authors of the report, the graphic poster design movement and the Cuban style of pop art that went with it was a product entirely of the revolution and the most important development to have occurred within the visual arts. They also celebrated the poster's ability to mobilize for social tasks, such as health drives or education, or indeed productivity campaigns, and its ability to commemorate historical events. Magazine covers, in particular, were similarly celebrated for being a mass medium of artistic expression that was both new to Cuba, but also something that was clearly revolutionary. At the end of the 1960s and during the 1970s, design became a key area for revolutionary artistic practice, as it involved an element of collectivity, more and more important during a period where there was a growing sense of global isolation, and the artist was increasingly viewed as a soldier, with some expectations that went with that. High quality was important in establishing links between art and industry, and there was a point of view that argued that design had to be beautiful to fulfill its role of promoting information or shaping attitudes. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the visual arts in Cuba became a site of intense debate about styles and roles as different conceptions of art and its role in society competed. Sometimes this resulted in an element of self-censorship, but I will discuss that a bit more later. So now back to Anna.
So returning then to the 1980s, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is an era in which we can see a really marked difference in terms of cover art to what had come before. There are several reasons why this shift possibly took place. And one of those is the leadership's drive to improve the country's defensive capacity in the early 1980s. So despite enjoying a period of relative stability up to that point, in 1980, the revolution was put to the test by a series of internal and external pressures, including a reheating of international Cold War tensions and a domestic expression of mass dissent, which both of which put the revolutionary leadership on high alert. For the Cuban people, this translated into continued calls for their participation to defend the revolution throughout the first half of the decade. Fidel Castro began to plant the seeds of a siege mentality and spoke explicitly of the need for a popular war to confront a prospective enemy aggression. This need was channeled into a concrete strategy, which was the so-called Guerra de todo el pueblo, or the War of All the People. Launched in May 1980 in the midst of the Mariel crisis, the War of All the People was a plan for nationwide mobilization around defense. To help achieve this goal, the Milicias de Tropas Territoriales, or the MTT, was created, which was a fast volunteer force designed to assist the FARC in its defensive operations. Added to this was the national defense exercise known as Bastion, which was launched in 1980, and two more took place in 1983 and 1986. So in terms then of magazine cover art during this period, Some of the first issues of Verde Olivo, which we can see on the slide, suggest some continuity with what had gone before. So we can see, for example, a reliance on the vibrant pop art and psychedelia-inspired graphic art that had been so popular in the 1960s and then had a bit of a resurgence in the late 1970s. And we can also see the usual symbols in evidence. The magazine's back and inside covers, however, told quite a different story and unequivocally painted a backdrop of verbal and visual references to siege and to the corresponding need for constant vigilance. These images mirrored the aforementioned growing climate of fear-mongering and national vulnerability, which was constantly reinforced in the leadership's discourse. The use of photographs on the back and inside covers, rather than illustrations, soon also became commonplace on the front covers as a means to both reflect as well as to continue to encourage the mass participation of the Cuban people in the new defensive strategy. Photographs, which became the principal mode of cover design as the decade progressed, often showed smiling soldiers and members of the MTT in an apparent attempt to give the FARC, as well as military action in general, a more human face. These images juxtaposed directly with the siege-infused discourse within the publication and in the broader public realm. They also reinforced the message that defence was a collective endeavour to be undertaken by each and every Cuban, particularly including women who appeared more frequently on the covers throughout the 1980s. In the second half then of the decade, this prevalence of photography remained, and actually it has done ever since, although with a seemingly new focus on demonstrating Cuba's military capacity. Images of tanks, aircraft and weaponry, all of which were largely funded by the Soviet Union, suggested a newfound confidence on the part of the leadership regarding Cuba's defensive capacity. And in fact, at this stage, Cuba had every reason to feel secure in this respect, having built an army of around 1.2 million reservists in the MTT and having carried out the largest ever military exercise in Bastion 1986. The images shown here in Verde Olivo and also in Bohemia paralleled the perhaps performative self-assuredness of the leadership's discourse, and at the same time give little indication of the troubles that would befall the island as the 1980s drew to a close. This more realist style adopted on the 1980s covers also aligned with the attitude of the revolutionary government towards artistic expression at this point. And as Izzy will now discuss, it generally favoured a more conformist and didactic art that rejected the experimental style of a new emerging generation of young Cuban artists.
So the process of renewal and reassessment after 1975 ignited a new wave of cultural creativity and expression. And this renewed enthusiasm for cultural creation meant that there was something of an artistic boom in the 1980s, peaking early on and tailing off towards the end. New genres developed, such as photorealism, and areas such as the plastic arts, which were quicker to respond than other mediums, thrived in a fertile and open space, which was clearly connected to contemporary art trends in Latin America, Europe, and the United States. One such example is artists of the new Cuban art that emerged at the beginning of the 1980s, and particularly linked to the landmark exhibition Woman in Uno. They put forth work that expressed the complex and interrelated cultural heritage of the nation, and that was in contact with global contemporary art practices. They also viewed art's revolutionary capacity in a different light, arguing that art was revolutionary in its independence of thought and its ethical foundations. Throughout the 1980s, their work became a site of struggle, a struggle that firmly believed in the power of art, but was aggressive and caustic at times, and often came up against or was involved in intense debate with cultural functionaries who perhaps took a different view. Parody was an important element of much of the reflective work produced, which often alluded to political and social problems and increasingly distanced itself from the official dialogue. Over the next decade, this led to the circulation of multiple artistic approaches, each of which in previous congresses had been deemed equally valid. Different approaches were promoted among the constituent roles of art assigned by the revolution, and this is where the magazine covers become interesting. Didacticism and verisimilitude was prized in public, educational and commemorative projects, utility and practical solutions to problems within the economy in which culture could play a role, and political engagement, high quality and multiple aesthetic styles was cherished within what might be considered the more institutional art spaces such as galleries, universities, and national or international exhibitions. We can begin to see the division of art into the different elements into its perceived different elements in the magazine covers that we've been looking at. The perceived function of a magazine cover also helps to explain this. As McLuhan has argued, the medium is the message. So each medium has its own message, which exists independently of and simultaneously with the content of the medium. Magazine covers are indeed no exception. Like a poster, a magazine cover is a piece of public art and therefore possesses many of the same educational purposes, which therefore kind of require clarity. But as a cover, it also has the function of summarizing the key element of the content of the entire magazine in its accessible and interesting visual shorthand. Finally, as the cover of a popular military magazine during the revolutionary process, the message had to develop a high responsiveness and a distinctly national style or approach best suited for its field of interest, or indeed fields of interest. Very often the covers of magazines functioned as a visual key capturing the spirit of the revolution in all its structural and ideological evolutions. However, this visual key was tempered by the perceived and shifting role of the magazine cover, which increasingly functioned as a small-scale informative piece of public art and the requirements that came with that. And that brings the beginnings of our argument to an end. So, any questions? Great, we'll be really happy to take them.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back, and Anna is not, I think, available because she has a personal issue, a family issue. But Izzy, you're here, aren't you? Do you want to make yourself visible?
I am, hopefully. My internet is atrocious today, so it might be good. Yeah, hey.
Hello, Izzy. So, questions, comments, anything that you'd like repeated from their presentation? Thank you very much, Isabel and Anna. Okay, I'm going to kick it off while people get their heads together. So it's really interesting looking at all of that material and looking at sort of the broad brushstrokes of changes in style, changes in content, etc., etc. And you said the use of photographic material, or the introduction of using more photographic material rather than that very kind of experimental art, was to give a more human face to the experience of the revolution in Bohemia, Verde Olivo, etc., etc. And you draw a link, whether it's Bohemia or Verde Olivo, and of course these are state publications, but you draw a link between those covers and what the political leadership is aiming to project, what particular dimension of that moment of the revolution or that period of the revolution. Can I ask, have you been able to access information from editorial teams of either Verde Olivo or Bohemia that kind of gives you the foundation of that, or is that a kind of a, because it's always interesting to see how representation and the ideology or the politics behind it respond to each other rather than
so far, no, we haven't had been able to contact any of the editorial teams. I've had a chat from some kind of previous research. I've had a chat with some of the artists that were involved in covers who have expressed that maybe they felt there was this, but it's also kind of, we began to draw that conclusion if you contrast what's happening in Verde Olivo with what's happening with Bohemia, which around, say, symbolic dates in perhaps the Soviet calendar, you see a sudden shift in the style of the covers that are used on Bohemia. So there's definitely that it's repeated enough and regular enough that it seems unlikely that it's just coincidence. I'd love to talk to the editorial teams, but not managed that yet. But there's also, if you kind of relate it back to what's happening in cultural policy more generally, there were these intense debates about the role of photorealism or the role of certain types of art. So you can kind of see it trickling down. But yeah, I'd love to do some interviews with editorial teams.
They may have archives. They may have institutional archives that you could just go through and see, what kinds of discussions were taking place. Okay, I'm going to hand over. There are questions appearing. So Michelle, welcome, and Gabrielle after that. So Michelle first. Michelle Chase.
Hi, I apologize. I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if you said anything, but I loved seeing all the little portadas that you put together at the end, and I noticed that there was a figure of a woman in the military at the bottom right. Yeah. And I just wondered how often you saw that women figured on the front of the covers, or whether you guys addressed the issue of gender and masculinity at all in the study.
So, I mean, we're really early on, so we haven't yet. But from kind of mid late 70s, you do see women appearing more and more, and some of the covers around International Women's Day are phenomenal. And really focusing on that, but it spreads out from just these kind of symbolic dates, and it's part of this kind of bringing the general into, or everyone becoming a member of potentially an active resistance force. Like you do have there are stages where it focuses more clearly on the idea of kind of the soldier, the traditional soldier, and what it is to be a soldier, but yeah, we need to do more on that. But women appear more than you might initially think, which is great. Quite waffly answer, but hopefully an answer.
Thank you. Thanks for the question and the answer. And Gabrielle? Oh.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks.
I think it's interesting to focus on precisely a military magazine in the 70s and 80s, and countries obviously undergoing a process of even further militarization. But I was wondering, I noticed you said you often refer to the defensive forces, but of course Cuba was fighting a quite drawn out an offensive war. I mean, we can argue about the merits of it, which certainly it had some merits, but there were tens of thousands of Cuban casualties in Angola in the 70s and 80s, particularly of Black Cubans. I noticed in a lot of those covers there's blondes or very white image of the military, and also a total absence of images of Angola. You would think in a military magazine there would be reporting on the large-scale current war that's happening. So your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and I think that kind of relates back to what the perceived goal of the publications at that time are. If it's a general military cultural magazine for predominantly domestic consumption, and the major mobilizational focus on a domestic footing is getting people ready for Bastion and combating this increasing sense of isolation and a rising worry that a form of external aggression is imminent. And so I think maybe there's this compartmentalization of kind of what needs to be done here versus what is going on there away from Cuba as part of its internationalism. And I think that maybe that is perhaps what's going on. And obviously these aren't, like, we have thousands of pictures of covers, but there are these notable absences. And I think it relates back to what the perceived kind of major goals domestically are.
Excellent. Patricia, if you want to make yourself visible, is a question from Patricia Calvo. And then that was the last question.
Hi, and you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask about Che Guevara, because I saw some covers with his image. So, for example, in Continental, I could say there was a reborn in the 80s about this figure. So you saw something similar in Verde Olivo?
I think not so much. Like, he does pop up again and again. We have a lot of focus on Camilo and a huge focus on on Camilo in Bohemia. But in Verde Olivo, you kind of have Che, but not like just straight up homages to Che. You maybe have him with Fidel or with Camilo, but he doesn't come back so much. It's more kind of general revolutionary scenes and equipment and soldiers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Jean, if you have a last question, your hand is up, and while you do that, I'm going to fiddle around and see if I can get Valeria's materials ready. Okay, so go ahead, Jean.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Do you have, or is it going to be part of the study, the circulation of the two magazines and the readership? Bohemia was a much more popular magazine that people would read, and Verde Olivo was always sort of, oh, that's the armed forces kind of thing. Yeah. And then I remember in the 80s, and this goes back to Gabrielle's question about the presence of the Angolan War, that there was a sort of a subtle shift, if you want, to some more human interest stories in Verde Olivo. I never read it consistently, so I'm speaking anecdotally. But the more the war dragged on, the more there were human interest and human tragedy stories and love stories and all kinds of things. So is that something you're going to be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely need to get hold of statistics of circulation and readership. And then once we have kind of got the covers down, yeah, we need to start sifting through and look at how the content and how it shifted, presented, and how it presented it. Definitely, yeah. So lots to do, but we're kind of excited about it. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think we are going to move on. Thank you very much, Izzy. Thank you, Anna, who's not here. Thank you anyway. And that whole presentation, so they have smashed it in many ways, including technologically. So the whole presentation intact is available once you can access those files. Okay, so Valeria González Lage. Welcome, Valeria. Your paper is Apuntes sobre la Historia del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de La Habana, 1962 a 1971. And I'm going to now attempt to play the audio and your PowerPoint. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, the audio has your... Okay, let's try.
Todos los oyentes, voy a apartar el pelo. Antes de nada y antes de compartir el PowerPoint, quería dar agradecimiento a la organización por todo el esfuerzo invertido en sacar adelante este acto en medio de la locomía que vivimos y pese a todas las dificultades que supone celebrarlo así a distancia como estamos haciendo. Así que antes de nada y principalmente mi agradecimiento. Voy a hablar sobre la historia del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de La Habana. Voy a presentar, ahí está la presentación, perdón. Esta institución fue creada por el gobierno cubano en el año 1963 para enseñar filosofía marxista y existió hasta el año 1971, año en el que fue depurado y reconvertido en otra institución con unos programas y unos profesores distintos a los que había habido en los años 60. El objetivo es presentar una evolución, muy brevemente, En la primera etapa introducimos tanto los antecedentes como el primer año de existencia del departamento. Esta institución se creó como resultado de la reforma universitaria que se aprobó en enero de 1962 y que estipulaba filosofía y economía marxistas como asignaturas obligatorias en todas las carreras universitarias. Recordemos que un año antes se había declarado el carácter socialista de la revolución. Se decidió entonces crear departamentos de filosofía en las 3 universidades. Yo aquí me centro en concreto en el departamento de La Habana, pero bueno es recordar que existieron también departamentos en las villas y en Oriente. Para dotar de profesorado el departamento se organizó un curso entre septiembre y diciembre de 1962 en la Escuela Nacional Cepero Bonilla, que dependía a su vez del sistema de escuelas de instrucción revolucionaria del partido. Este curso fue interno y en él tuvieron un peso importante profesores hispano-soviéticos. Una vez seleccionado el personal, en torno a 25 miembros, se creó oficialmente el departamento en febrero de 1963. Tanto el curso en la Escuela Nacional Cepero Bonilla como durante el primer año de docencia del departamento, el marxismo que se proyectó tuvo un carácter manualístico. Los materiales básicos de docencia y también de formación del profesorado fueron manuales soviéticos, particularmente el escrito por Konstantinov. Este recurso a manuales extranjeros no fue exclusivo del departamento, fue una experiencia que se reprodujo en muchas ramas universitarias. Recordemos que en esos años Cuba carecía de bibliografía actualizada. En este primer año la asignatura estaba dividida en dos partes, materialismo dialéctico y materialismo histórico, y solo un apartado al final estaba dedicado a la Revolución cubana. La siguiente etapa, 64-65, estuvo caracterizada por la reorientación de los programas y el rechazo a los manuales. En este viraje fue clave la reunión que el colectivo mantuvo con el presidente de la República, Osvaldo Ortecós, en febrero de 1964. En este encuentro se trataron multitud de temas, pero lo más novedoso fue que Ortecós expuso allí cuál era el enfoque que se le habría de dar a la enseñanza de la filosofía en Cuba. Destaco tres novedades. Primera, el presidente instó al colectivo a enfocar el marxismo-leninismo desde un punto de vista nacional. Segunda, recomendó en la medida de lo posible, no usar los manuales extranjeros por cuanto estaban adaptados a un contexto diferente y porque de lo que se trataba era no de enseñar dogmas, sino de hacer pensar al estudiante con un sentido crítico. Y tercero, aconsejó analizar directamente a los clásicos y que el propio profesorado comprobase por ellos mismos qué deficiencias y qué méritos tenían esas obras de los clásicos. Ortecós entendía que solo así, con el paso de los años, se lograría un mecanismo eficiente de razonamiento y de estudio. En octubre de 1964 se reunieron los profesores de La Habana, Villas y Oriente. En esa reunión, el Departamento de La Habana hizo público que no seguiría usando los manuales soviéticos. Aquí, por supuesto, la reunión con Ortecós dio impulso a este viraje, pero no fue el único factor. Había un caldo de cultivo, digamos. Tanto el proceso del sectarismo como la crisis de octubre, el gran debate en la economía que se estaba dando, las polémicas culturales también, es decir, todos esos factores habían contribuido. Se presenciaba un clima de búsqueda y de independencia en todos los sentidos. Tras la reunión se abrió un periodo de experimentación con los programas y se dedicaron a la tarea de estructurar un programa nuevo propio que sustituyese al anterior. Este fue una época de búsqueda en todos los sentidos, en todas las direcciones, no solo en los programas, sino también la diversificación de lecturas. Se volcaron a analizar los clásicos y incorporaron ahora también a pensadores cubanos, latinoamericanos e occidentales. Aparece José Martí, Enrique Barona, Mao Zedong, Mariátegui, Lage, Gramsci, Althusser, etc. De nuevo aclaro aquí que esta diversificación no fue exclusiva del departamento. El departamento estaba leyendo a Gramsci o a Althusser, por citar algunos ejemplos, pero también en Casa de las Américas o en la UNIAC se estaban leyendo. No me atrevería a decir que esta diversificación fue generalizada en Cuba, pero tampoco desde luego exclusiva del departamento. La tercera etapa, entre 66 y 68, en este periodo el sentido de búsqueda iniciado en años anteriores se materializó y se concretó en un programa maduro. La apuesta en estos años del departamento fue enseñar el marxismo-leninismo a partir de lo que ellos denominaron el método histórico-crítico, es decir, interpretar y explicar el pensamiento marxista, sus autores y diferentes etapas a partir de las circunstancias sociales, económicas y políticas en las que habían sido creadas. Cada autor y su pensamiento contextualizado y no transmitido al estudiantado como un sistema eterno e inmutable, digamos. Cambiaron el nombre en esta época de la asignatura llamada ahora Historia del Pensamiento Marxista y al final de la etapa contaban ya con un programa estable. Como vemos, estaba planteado como una sucesión histórica de autores y de etapas que dialogaban con su devenir social, con sus circunstancias de gestación. Más importante también aparece aquí ahora América Latina, el tercer mundo, los movimientos revolucionarios y también la Revolución cubana, que estaba tratada principalmente en el último apartado. Crearon materiales de enseñanza propios, uno en 1966 y otro en 1968. El más destacable fue este último, dividido en 2 tomos. Resaltaré 3 cuestiones principales aquí. La primera, que se observa en este tomo el método histórico que defendía el departamento. Como se ve, se incorpora todo un bloque dedicado a la introducción histórica de la filosofía, una especie de estado de la cuestión que permitiese comprender el origen del marxismo. Se constata también la diversificación de autores, aparece Althusser, Gramsci, Fanon, Lage, Debré, etc. Y por último reflejan una clara conexión con América Latina, con el tercer mundo y con lo que el Departamento de Filosofía eran los 2 principales problemas contemporáneos. la revolución en los países subdesarrollados y el periodo de transición al comunismo que vivía Cuba. Temas a los que se le dedicaron bloques enteros, como podemos ver. En esta etapa también se incrementó la presencia del colectivo en actividades y en eventos nacionales. Participaron en la creación del proyecto de ediciones revolucionarias que pretendía copiar libros extranjeros y reproducirlos en Cuba sin pagar derechos de autor. Este es el ejemplo de Por Mars, de Althusser. También la revista Caimán Barbudo, dirigida entre 1966 y 1967 por un integrante del departamento, Jesús Díaz. Y por último, sobresale la creación de la revista Pensamiento Crítico en el año 1967, que fungió como principal vocero del grupo. La revista Pensamiento Crítico, su consejo de dirección y director pertenecían al colectivo y su historia está estrechamente vinculada al departamento. La revista se cierra en el año 1971, en junio, y el departamento meses después. De hecho, digamos que son proyectos vinculados y estrechamente ligados. La última etapa del departamento discurre desde 1969 hasta 1971. En esta etapa se dieron algunos cambios, pero sin duda la novedad principal fue la aparición de dificultades que condujeron finalmente al fin del proyecto del departamento. Primero, se crea el Partido Comunista de Cuba en el interior de la universidad. Esto supuso canales directos para orientar el trabajo del departamento y ventilar problemas que en segundo lugar, el departamento se estructuró. Una de las metas básicas en estos años, de hecho, era aumentar la producción científica propia. El departamento que ya estaba en condiciones de interpretación de los autores leídos y que se pero, como comenté anteriormente, fue un proceso de crecimiento interrumpido por una serie de dificultades. La primera, la etapa de millones. En agosto de 1969, el departamento estuvo evidentemente constante. Las otras dos dificultades, que son las principales y que condujeron al departamento, se pueden dividir en, por un lado, un factor específico referido al trabajo del colectivo en concreto y, por otro lado, a escala macro, si se quiere, el contexto general de la revolución. A nivel nacional, durante esta última etapa se incrementaron las críticas al trabajo del departamento y a su posicionamiento teórico. Sabemos al menos que hubo oposición en el interior de la Facultad de Humanidades, en la Escuela de Ciencias Políticas y en la Escuela de Letras, por los contenidos que se estaban impartiendo al alumnado. Hubo contradicciones también con antiguos profesores de las escuelas de instrucción revolucionaria del partido, que habían mostrado su oposición, su desacuerdo con el departamento años atrás. Eso se recoge en el escrito que se ha enviado anteriormente, y lo hicieron de nuevo ahora en 1970. Para ellos, para estos profesores, el colectivo de filosofía estaba encaminándose a una visión voluntarista del proceso social, que negaba leyes generales del marxismo y que por lo tanto eran antimarxistas. Y por último, hubo juicios también negativos hacia el Departamento de Filosofía por parte de autoridades revolucionarias. En septiembre de 1970, Raúl Castro criticó las interpretaciones superficiales de Marx, de Engels y de Lenin que habían surgido, planteamientos que, a su parecer, eran de confuso carácter ideológico. Y lo más grave para el comandante era que estas ideas se estaban transmitiendo a los alumnos. Aquí se ve esa consideración de la educación desde el punto de vista político también, para crear un consenso. Tenemos, por tanto, oposición de sectores de la ortodoxia nacional, ortodoxia aquí no en un sentido de defensa o ultranza del modelo soviético. Uso el término ortodoxia porque defendían la ortodoxia de la teoría marxista y la ortodoxia de las leyes generales del marxismo. Como escenario de fondo está presente el contexto general de la revolución en los años 70, de institucionalización y de reconfiguración de los objetivos inmediatos. En este punto no voy a detenerme. Se ha analizado este tema en múltiples investigaciones. Hay debates sobre cuándo empezó este cambio, sobre su intensidad, pero no hay duda de que efectivamente hubo un cambio, que las bases de la revolución se modificaron durante los años 70. Fracasa la zafra, hay una crisis económica, Cuba entra en el CAM en el año 1972, cae en combate Guevara y brevemente en el campo cultural se da el llamado popularmente como quinquenio gris. De modo que, para ir cerrando la exposición, visto en contexto el fin del proyecto del Departamento de Filosofía, en 1971 era parte de un proceso mucho más amplio. En su cierre creemos que se combinaron las críticas de la ortodoxia nacional, que estaba ganando espacios, y una reorientación de las prioridades de la revolución en todos los ámbitos sociales. En esta nueva realidad, el planteamiento del departamento fue cuestionado y dejaría de ser tributario, de ser beneficioso a las líneas programáticas de la revolución. El punto final llega, como dije, en 1971. En junio, el Pensamiento Crítico, la revista, publicó su último número y a lo largo de los meses siguientes la mayoría de los miembros del Departamento de Filosofía fueron dispersados y reubicados en otras instituciones. A partir de 1972, la institución fue reconvertida en el Departamento para la Enseñanza del Marxismo-Leninismo, con otros profesores y otros contenidos más cercanos a lo que yo aquí he denominado como ortodoxia nacional. Hasta aquí la exposición y muy brevemente presentada. Doy paso ahora a las preguntas que puedan haber surgido, no sin antes comentar que la foto con la que habría, bueno, ahí se pueden ver varios miembros del Departamento de Filosofía y de donde fue extractada, por supuesto, que aparece en la multimedia elaborada por la Biblioteca Nacional José Martí de Pensamiento Crítico. Así que hasta aquí y muchas gracias por...
Gracias, Valeria.
Bueno, ¿hay preguntas o comentarios sobre esto para Valeria, que está aquí? No. Bueno, entonces yo tengo una pregunta para ti, Valeria. Me interesaba mucho ver mención de Gramsci y Mariátegui y los de Althusser también, porque yo recuerdo que Fernando Martínez me dijo que que él, la versión en español de Gramsci, de los escritos de Gramsci, apareció en Cuba muchos años antes de la aparición aquí en Inglaterra, por ejemplo. Pero tú sabes qué aspectos de Gramsci impartieron, hasta qué punto formaba parte importante del nuevo marxismo.
Sí, bueno, antes de nada quería pedir disculpas porque se ve que el audio, aún grabándolo, no ha llegado como yo hubiese deseado. Y sobre el tema de Gramsci, llegó en los años 60. Primero llegó por las ediciones de Lautaro, que fue la que se popularizó en América Latina sobre todo, y después fue reproducido en las ediciones revolucionarias y ya en el Instituto Cubano del Libro. De Gramsci sobre todo les interesaba el concepto de hegemonía y cómo a través de la intelectualidad y de la creación de un nuevo consenso se podía luchar contra la hegemonía del imperialismo. Ese fue uno de los conceptos que más interiorizaron, yo considero. Y, por supuesto, siendo ellos intelectuales que querían ser orgánicos al proceso, o una parte de la intelectualidad orgánica de la Revolución Cubana, pues ellos interiorizaron el concepto de hegemonía y de intelectualidad orgánica para crear un nuevo consenso en torno al socialismo en Cuba. Yo creo que fuese el que más influyó.
Ajá,
De Gramsci.
Gracias.
De todas formas, como un apunte breve, en esta época, porque quizás eso no lo he explicado lo suficientemente, en esta época, en los años 60, este colectivo del Departamento de Filosofía se dedicaron sobre todo a estudiar a esos autores. Y fue a partir del año 69-70 que ya iniciaron un proceso de maduración de su posicionamiento y que ya estaban en condiciones de interpretar lo que ellos consideraban más positivo o más negativo de Althusser, de Gramsci, etc. Pero en esos primeros años se dedicaron sobre todo a estudiar, porque muchos autores no eran conocidos para ellos. Gramsci es el caso, Althusser, por ejemplo. Y Althusser lo interiorizaron y lo adaptaron en un primer momento, bueno, lo leyeron, y después en la última etapa, a partir del año 1969, ya comenzaron a criticarlo porque consideraban que se estaba convirtiendo en un teórico del Partido Comunista Francés y ya como que comenzaron a separarse un poco de la visión althusseriana. Entonces creo que fue un proceso y primero se dedicaron a estudiar y a conocer y después vendría la maduración, que estuvo cortada, por supuesto.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Are there any other questions before we move on to the last paper?
Sí, yo tenía una pregunta, no he levantado la mano, no sé si me veis. I've got a question, yeah. Valeria, me parece muy interesante tu investigación y yo como economista y como profesora de un área de Historia e Instituciones Económicas donde impartimos la asignatura de Pensamiento Económico, me preguntaba, aunque no es parte de tu investigación, cómo evoluciona ese departamento hacia la Facultad de Economía, ¿no? Yo tengo colegas que tienen a sus hijos en la actualidad en la Facultad de Economía de La Habana y me preguntaba, ¿no? Si se crea posteriormente, o si has tenido la oportunidad de investigar, si se crea posteriormente un departamento de economía política, ¿no? Supongo. Entonces, me parece que probablemente, aunque no sea el objetivo de tu investigación, sería interesante ver hacia dónde va, ¿no? Porque el papel que tiene la economía política en las facultades de economía es muy interesante, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, simplemente si habías tenido la oportunidad de saber, ¿no? El rol que había tenido una vez que se extingue ese departamento, una vez que Cuba entra en el Consejo de Ayuda Mutua Económica, y si realmente hace un proceso de transición y penetra, ¿no? Como supongo que haría, en la Facultad de Economía con un departamento de Economía Política, que sería lo lógico. Gracias, Valeria, muy interesante.
Muchas gracias. Realmente, cuando se crea, es decir, cuando se aprueba la reforma universitaria, que de ahí parte el Departamento de Filosofía, en esa reforma universitaria se estipula que se va a estudiar filosofía marxista y también economía política marxista. Entonces se crean departamentos de filosofía marxista por un lado y departamentos, grupos de economía política marxista por el otro. Entonces digamos que nacieron del mismo tronco de la reforma universitaria, pero tuvieron una vida separada. Entonces, por un lado camina la filosofía marxista, el departamento, y por el otro la economía política. Una vez que se cierra el departamento de filosofía, se crea, bueno, se reconvierte en departamento para la enseñanza del marxismo-leninismo y sigue esa vida. Pero el departamento de economía política ya existía y ya tenía su camino y ya, bueno, ya había comenzado a enseñar la economía política marxista en Cuba. Una vez que se cierra cómo convive el Departamento de Economía Política y de Enseñanza del Marxismo-Leninismo, la verdad es que ese tema sí que no lo conozco, pero imagino que tendrían lazos más comunes porque ya esas críticas o esa posición que pudo haber surgido en los años 60 con la visión del Departamento de Filosofía, una vez que es reconvertido en enseñanza del marxismo-leninismo, pues supongo que serán más próximos. Y de hecho, bueno, como apunte, en el Departamento de Economía Política, que se creó ya en el año 62, uno de los profesores iniciales era Humberto Pérez, que acabó siendo un crítico del Departamento de Filosofía. Entonces, son ahí historias que muchas veces conviven las personas, protagonistas, y se mezclan ya muchos más elementos.
Okay, many thanks indeed, Valeria. And we now move on to the final paper, which is a recording, in fact, by Luis Boffill, a short recording, because his PowerPoint, his text rather, is available on the files, we hope, anyway.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just trying to, could you just pass that on to Izzy?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen, which is the written text and a Word document, and I'm going to start the audio first of all. Okay, so please bear with me.
sectores más ricos y pudientes del país, a los cuales estaban nacionalizando muchas de sus propiedades, se fueron, pero dejaron sus autos en nuevas, buenas manos. En una revolución que adquirió el carácter socialista, el proletario jugaría un papel fundamental. Este obrero pasó a ser el nuevo dueño de los almendrones que quedaron desamparados. El bloqueo imprimió un cambio en la fisonomía de estos autos, en tanto la imposibilidad de importar determinadas piezas determinó características anatómicas difíciles de definir. Surgía un nuevo carro e innovación de los cubanos. Esta situación se agravará con la crisis de los años 90, la cual trajo el cambio de combustible en estos autos. Pese a todos estos disturbios, el almendrón resistió a los 90. Además, el siglo XXI adicionó una nueva realidad, la compraventa de autos. Un paréntesis para hablar de cuestiones conocidas por los cubanos e incluso por los que nos visitan. Los almendrones, como ya dije, constituyen una alternativa al transporte urbano. Generalmente los trayectos costaban 10 pesos cubanos, aunque en los últimos tiempos las cifras se han elevado, que ya no son 10 pesos y ahora me dices que es a 20 pesos la carrera. Diversos son los usos de nuestro personaje: transporte intermunicipal, alquiler a turistas, traslado de productos y otros. Para quienes viven en la isla, no es un secreto cuántas transformaciones e ingenios sufren los autos almendrones que perduran ya por un espacio de más de 7 décadas. Los mecánicos realizan una labor titánica. Deben conseguir los repuestos o sustituirlos por piezas parecidas que ellos mismos fabrican. En estos tiempos no resulta para nada raro encontrarte la carrocería de un Ford en un almendrón de marca Chevrolet. Algunos de estos autos funcionan aún con sus piezas originales, pero estos han logrado extender su vida útil gracias a la inventiva que realizan los cubanos en el área de la mecánica. Así afirma la rapera del Maris cuando expresa en su canción Cógela como arte. Motor de cilindros de la Volva, los frenos buenos de la Ford Falcón, para la presión sistema de Volvo, sistema hidráulico de la Mercedes-Benz. Otras modificaciones han para que el almendrón continúe en pie y mantenga su utilidad. Los dueños, al adaptar estos vehículos, le han agregado aditamentos a su estructura interna, como motores y piezas de otros coches. Actualmente, el almendrón se convierte en el Frankenstein cubano, un auto eminentemente nacional lleno de componentes de otros vehículos y equipos electrónicos. Cuando le das un vistazo a su motor, evidentemente no pueden mantener el que trajo de fábrica, ya que el paso del tiempo y la no producción e importación de piezas de repuesto no se lo permiten. Los mecánicos cubanos no se dan por vencidos. Sustituyen el motor del almendrón por el de un Lada o por el de un camión viejo, generalmente de fabricación soviética. Para repararlos se han llegado a utilizar componentes de lavadora, motores de tractor soviético, fusiles de aviones antiguos y neveras opuestas de refrigeradores norteamericanos. No se tiene en cuenta su imagen y estética, o que expuse mucho humo. Lo más importante es que logre andar. Así lo expresa Arnaldo y su talismán en su canción El Almendrón. Y mi almendrón está viejo pero se mueve. Está viejo pero se mueve. Mi almendrón del 59. Está viejo pero resuelve. Estos autos cuentan con una capacidad para montar a 5 personas además del conductor. Pero en este sentido también se han hecho cambios estructurales. En la actualidad, los chapisteros han estirado la carrocería de algunos almendrones hasta unas 10 plazas. A otros les han quitado la cubierta, es decir, los han convertido en descapotables porque constituyen un atractivo para la actividad turística. Dentro de las transformaciones sufridas para su funcionamiento se encuentra el cambio de combustible. Para prestar sus servicios se alimentan lo mismo con gasolina que con petróleo, y gracias a la inventiva de los mecánicos automotrices no consumen mucho. Luz brillante como arde para mi Chevrolet que camina y 2 carburadores, uno para la gasolina y otra para luz brillante. Los fabulosos autos clásicos prerevolucionarios que circulan por las ciudades cubanas se han convertido en emblemas de nuestra cultura nacional. Luego de la caída del campo socialista, para muchos cubanos tener un almendrón era la mayor posibilidad de poseer un coche. Esto se agravaba con el aún vigente bloqueo económico que limitaba la entrada de autos modernos de estas marcas u otras nuevas al país. Ante tales circunstancias, cualquier acción valía para mantener con vida y en marcha a los llamados museos rodantes. El almendrón se presenta ante una disyuntiva. Se considera como patrimonio cultural o como atraso tecnológico. Algunos detractores del proceso socialista revolucionario cubano lo muestran como un símbolo del retraso económico y la pobreza que existe en la isla. Que son autos viejos y que constituyen un atraso tecnológico es una realidad. Ay Juan, su almendrón a veces no arranca y su esperanza no vacila. Coge el timón, tira la palanca, ahí va Juan luchando la vida. Aún así, es admirable con la majestuosidad y conservación que se pasean por las calles del país compitiendo con los carros más modernos. Dice Juan que ayer se compró un cacharro buscando mejor economía y aunque está viejo su carro, aún puede con los baches en la vía. Otras personas temen que ocurra un accidente por algún desperfecto técnico, pero esos son los pocos, porque actualmente el almendrón es el auto del momento, para fines turísticos o para el negocio por cuenta propia. Ay, qué bonito está tu carrito, bien moderno y qué nuevecito, pero yo me quedo con el almendrón. Ay Juan, él no quiere saber de un auto moderno. Por eso no debemos avergonzarnos de nuestro viajero de pasado, ya que tenemos la dicha de contar con un auto que funciona con cualquier dispositivo adaptado a su sistema, lo que lo hace único en su especie. Entonces, el almendrón se presenta como el automóvil insignia de Cuba, conformado con piezas prestadas de otros equipos y en ocasiones inventadas. Aunque su ingeniería automotriz es obsoleta, se reajusta y asimila todo lo que con ingenio recibe en el área de la mecánica. Por eso se conserva activo y operante. Pese a no recurrir a un local donde comprar piezas para su reparación, vence la barrera del tiempo y continúa en movimiento. Al compás de la musiquita del momento, Juan va por la carretera y sigue desafiando el tiempo con su máquina que acelera. Un auto que camina a pesar de sus limitaciones tecnológicas. Es adaptable a cualquier época. Es un atractivo para los turistas que nos visitan y sirve como medio de transportación para los cubanos. Constituye un elemento importante de nuestra historia, un patrimonio cultural. Lo cierto es que, si usted decide subirse a un almendrón, tendrá la oportunidad de enterarse de las noticias de la calle. Se pondrá al corriente de permutas y ventas, escuchará confesiones de personas desconocidas, o simplemente tendrá que compartir el gusto musical de su dueño que le hará escuchar las canciones de su preferencia. Muchos negocios particulares han empleado los almendrones en su logotipo. También podemos presenciar estos autos sonando sus bocinas por toda la carretera destino a la iglesia cuando dos enamorados quieren consumar su unión por medio del matrimonio. En la promoción de La Habana 500 constituye uno de los símbolos de esa urbe capitalina y se demuestra en muchos carteles que circulan por las paradas cubanas y otras instituciones estatales. Nuestro clásico almendrón también ha devenido en fuente de inspiración para muchas manifestaciones artísticas. No solo se emplea en la esfera turística como souvenir, donde lo vemos desde un simple llavero hasta dando un recorrido por la ciudad a quienes la visitan. También en fotos, pinturas, cerámicas, artesanías, obras audiovisuales, carteles de obras teatrales y en la música cubana ha pasado a ser el gran protagonista, constituyendo uno de los elementos identificativos de Cuba en el exterior. Una fuente de ingreso para sus dueños, un elemento identificativo de la ciudad, un atractivo turístico, atraso tecnológico y patrimonio cultural. Sin dudas, el almendrón se corresponde con todo eso. Es una de las imágenes icónicas e identitarias de la capital de Cuba y en general de la isla. Este automóvil llegó para quedarse y sigue dejando sus huellas del pasado en un futuro que lo van consolidando aún más como alternativa o apoyo al transporte público. Esto es Cuba, te salva que hay almendrones. Muchas gracias.
Okay, we are back. So I think maybe what we're going to do is just have a couple of minutes break and then we're going to move on to our next panel, which is panel 6, Cuba's Changing Society Before and After 1959. So let's just take a couple of minutes to empty our heads, put our hands down, comfort breaks, etc., etc. See you in 2 minutes.
Okay, I think we can get started. We started 10 minutes late on the previous one simply because we hadn't expected the ambassador to speak, but that was fine, that was no problem, and we can save a bit of time actually towards the end of this, so we're fine. We start now. So can we start with the panel on Cuba's changing society before and after 1959, la sociedad cubana en cambio antes y después de 59. And can we start please with Manuel Ramirez Chicharro of UNAM, Mexico, and Michelle Chase. So I don't know if it's PACE or PACE, but anyway.
Pace University.
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
Manuel is saying un minuto. He's about to get off a train, it looks like, so that's fine. Let's take un minuto, con calma, todo con calma. No hay problema. Mientras tanto, Michelle, do you want me to run your PowerPoint or do you want to run it yourselves?
Either way, whatever you think is easiest.
As long as you can say to me next, and I'll keep track.
Please do, that would be great.
Excellent. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint so we can get started. And then Manuel and Michelle, whenever you're ready to start, go ahead. This is fascinating. This is a mobile conference. I'm loving this. It's absolutely brilliant. Next time we should be moving around.
Let's see.
Móvil, ¿no? He's out. He's
Sí.
out.
¿Me pueden escuchar?
Sí,
pueden escuchar?
Sí, bastante bien.
Sí. Ay, gracias. Disculpen, es que no he podido llegar a casa. Estoy en medio de una estación y bueno, no quería perderme el encuentro con ustedes. Bueno, pues, Princesa, gracias por aceptar la propuesta. Lo que vamos a hacer hoy es presentar muy brevemente un trabajo que la profesora Michelle Chase y yo hemos realizado durante el año anterior, y es un poco sacar a la luz la figura de Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa. Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa, a nivel documental, pues empezamos a encontrarla sobre todo a partir de los años 30, pero tenemos constancia de que ella nació en 1901. ¿Puede pasar la diapositiva, por favor? Sí, bien. Aquí ya la encontramos en los años 30, muy vinculada al Partido Comunista de Cuba, pero sobre todo a asociaciones feministas como la Asociación Laborista de Mujeres y la Asociación Radical de Mujeres. Pero previamente, por la trayectoria que ella llevó a cabo durante los años 30 y 40 y por declaraciones suyas en la prensa, sabemos que estuvo también muy vinculada al Partido Comunista desde los años 20. Ella nació en Guevara, en la provincia de Oriente, pero como vemos aquí en esta diapositiva, ella estudió farmacia. Y en aquel momento la carrera de farmacia solamente se ofrecía en la Universidad de La Habana. Luego presumimos que se fue a la Universidad de La Habana. Y allí, como ella hace en declaraciones a la prensa, pues conoció a Julio Antonio Mella y probablemente, dado que estudió farmacia en la Facultad de Ciencias, quizás conoció también a Antonio Guiteras, que también estudió una carrera de ciencias. Después ya, si puede avanzar por favor a la siguiente diapositiva, y así dejo. Entonces presumimos que tanto el haber nacido en Oriente como el haberse formado en círculos en la Universidad de La Habana, que tenía un gran activismo en los años 20, el haber podido conocer, como ella dijo, a Julio Antonio Mella, y el haber estado en los años 20 en La Habana, donde se celebraron numerosos congresos de las mujeres, fueron forjando un pensamiento en el que se conglomeró el antirracismo, el comunismo y el feminismo. Y esto ella lo constata en las siguientes diapositivas, como voy a explicar brevemente antes de darle la palabra a Michelle. ¿Podemos pasar, por favor, la diapositiva? Estoy sonriendo, pero lo que pasa es que llevo la máscara. Bien, estamos entonces en 1939. Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa asiste al tercer Congreso Nacional de Mujeres, y fue este primer Congreso Nacional de Mujeres este tercer congreso fue el primero que contó con una mesa específicamente dedicada a abordar y a estudiar la situación de las mujeres negras en Cuba. y presumimos, digo, no tenemos información, pero también por los contactos que ella tenía con Ofelia Domínguez Navarro, que participó en este evento, pues presumimos que pudo tener algún tipo de papel activo en la sesión. Pasamos a la siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Gracias. Luego Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa, que ya era miembro activo de la Unión Revolucionaria Comunista, fue elegida como representante de la URC para formar parte de la Convención Constituyente que redactó la Constitución de 1940. Pasamos a la siguiente diapositiva. Como vemos, los votos que recibió Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa nos hacen ver que era una persona bastante importante. Quiero decir, no tenía tanto como Blas Roca o Santiago Agüero, pero tuvo muchos más votos de apoyo que Juan Marimelo. Luego también nos está hablando esto de la gran relevancia que esta mujer tenía que tener dentro del Partido Comunista en aquel momento. Pasamos a la siguiente, por favor. Dentro de esta convención constituyente, Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa fue la secretaria de la mesa que redactó los artículos contra la discriminación racial en Cuba, que fueron ratificados en la Constitución del 40. Y esto es especialmente importante, ¿no? Que ella, que había tenido toda esta gran trayectoria de activismo comunista y feminista y presumiblemente antirracista, participó específicamente en esta mesa. Pasamos a la siguiente, y ya voy cerrando para dar la palabra a Michelle. Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa, después de que la Constitución se ratifica en 1940, fue electa durante 2 legislaturas como representante de la Unión Revolucionaria de Cuba y fue la representante del Partido Comunista en Oriente con el mayor número de votos. Y ya para entonces, Partido Socialista Popular, Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa fue, como digo, representante parlamentaria del 44 al 48 y del 48 al 52, pero hubo un alejamiento que ahora explicará mi compañera Michelle, la profesora Michelle. Gracias. Te doy la palabra.
Thank you, Manuel. Can you guys hear me? I just wanted to say a couple of things before I go to the next slides about how we got started on the project. Manuel and I had both come across mentions of Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa in our respective research about the history of women's activism and of feminism in Cuba, but we realized that she had never been appreciated as a figure in Cuban historiography. She had not been included. Neither she nor many other Afro-Cuban women had been recognized in the history of Cuban feminism. So we wanted to restore a sense of her importance for the national history of feminism, right? And to also point out that there were other strands of radical feminism which found their home on the Marxist left and not merely the more liberal forms of feminism, which a first wave feminism in Cuba, which I think people have published more about. But we also found it important to see her in a broader, more global context. And we wanted to position her, to kind of rescue her and argue that she should be recognized as a pioneer of Black left feminism and of intersectional feminism. She and other women from the African diaspora pioneered the idea of denouncing the triple oppression of Black working class women, right? And we're more familiar with this idea from people who have done work in the US context. For example, we were both interested in the work of Eric McDuffie and Carol Boyce Davies, who have done a great job of recovering the role of and the importance of Claudia Jones and other Black women who are associated with the Communist Party in the United States, or maybe from the English-speaking Caribbean. But nobody had really taken, I think, the time to reassess potentially the role of a woman like Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa from Cuba or from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to kind of bring her into this conversation and recognize her as a pioneer of a kind of intersectional feminism that is either seen as coming from the United States and the Caribbean kind of in the 1930s. That's like the newer wave of research from women who are affiliated with the Communist Party, or more typically seen as emerging in the 1970s in second wave feminism in the global north. You guys might be familiar with, the Combahee River Collective statement of 1977, right? So this is kind of what we're trying to do. And Manuel has done a great job at laying out what we know about her and her activism in the 1930s and her important representation to the Third National Women's Congress in Cuba in 1939, and then to the Constitutional Convention in 1940, and elected as a congresswoman, the first Afro-Cuban congresswoman, right, from 1944 to 1950. Par, if you would go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about 3 more points in the time that I have left. One is her role in an important group called the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas. The second point that I want to talk about is her important attempts to redraft Cuba's antiquated Código Civil, the Civil Code. And then the third thing I'll mention is her expulsion from the Communist Party in 1950. So as you can see from the slide, she was one of the founders of a group called the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, which Manuel and I have both done research on. This is a group that was the Cuban chapter of the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was founded, the Women's International Democratic Federation was founded after the war. It was a umbrella federation of anti-fascist women. It was founded by European women, but very quickly spread around the globe. It was partly funded by the Soviets, and it became more and more pro-Soviet as the Cold War wore on. So for many years during the Cold War, historians of feminism had overlooked this organization, but now people are starting to reassess it and see it as an important organization, a global organization that addressed race, gender, colonialism, class, right? It addressed all these issues much earlier than second wave feminism. She was one of the founders of the Cuban chapter, the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, which was founded in 1948 and had a very close association with the Communist Party of Cuba. And in a way, we see this, the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, as kind of the culmination of her activism. It provided an institutional platform from which she could advance her ideas about the triple oppression of Black women. And this group, in addition to talking about race, class, and gender, also put a big emphasis on the importance of organizing rural women, poor women in the countryside. And it became an important vehicle, this group, for organizing leftist women of Afro-Cuban descent, right? Herself, she was a leader, but you may also know Maria Argüelles and Justina Álvarez as important Afro-Cuban activists and journalists associated with the Communist Party. And so we argue that Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa and these other women helped push an anti-racist agenda onto this group's platform. It also was important in putting Sánchez Mastrapa and other FDMC leaders in touch with like-minded women around the world, including from the socialist world. Par, if you would go to the next slide. Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa, as you can see, spoke at the second Congress of the WIDF, the umbrella organization, which was held in Budapest in 1948. And in her speech, she strongly denounced racism in Cuba and the special exploitation faced by Black working class Afro-Cuban women. Could you go to the next slide, please? Here you can see some of the important quotes from this major speech that she made. And she echoed many of these assertions in the major conference that the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas held at their first national congress in Havana in 1950. Could you go to the next slide? The second issue that I wanted to mention was that in these years, she penned an important draft of a revision of Cuba's Código Civil, which in many ways was very antiquated. It was based on the 1899 Código Civil of Spain. It had applied to Spanish colonies as well, like Puerto Rico and Cuba. And it contravened the 1940 Constitution in important ways. The 1940 Constitution, as you know, and as Manuel has mentioned, was a very progressive document which enshrined racial equality and gender equality. But the Código Civil, in fact, gave husbands power over their wives and many financial and legal issues, such as property rights. It judged women more harshly for adultery than men. It granted men some of the benefits of custody of childcare in cases of divorce. So in other words, there was a kind of divergence between the 1940 Constitution and the 1899 Código Civil. And Sánchez Mastrapa drafted this important revision, which was referred to as La Equiparación Civil de la Mujer, which was then pushed through Congress by herself and other Communist Party representatives, and was in fact approved in 1950, and it was the most important revision made to the Código Civil until the Family Code of 1975. However, unfortunately, and complicating the picture, just at this moment when this was being passed in the very end of 1950, Sánchez Mastrapa also had a falling out with the Communist Party. So this is the last point that I'm going to discuss before we end our presentation. If you could go forward one slide or maybe two, you can go to the next one. Yeah, so she had a falling out with the PSP and consequently was expelled from both the PSP and the FDMC. We're not entirely sure what the reasons for this was. The PSP denounced her in very scathing language, the leadership of the PSP, of the Communist Party, for not fulfilling her duties, for yeah, essentially not fulfilling her duties, and they it may have also had to do with the fact that she was in a relationship apparently with somebody outside of the Communist Party. But we have also pointed out in our research that this also coincided with the outbreak of the Korean War. There were a lot of rumors within Cuba that the Communist Party would be outlawed, and it may be that she feared losing her congressional seat or even being forced to go underground. And the PSP, the Communist Party, lost many members in this period. She was not the only one. But one final point I wanted to make about this is that it's interesting to contrast the really scathing language used to denounce her by the male leaders of the Communist Party, such as Blas Roca, who referred to her as cowardly, a traitor, and even as a poor Black woman who could never have been anything without the Communist Party. In contrast to her much more formal, you can see here the announcement of her expulsion from the FDMC, which was a much more kind of restrained denunciation for merely being derelict in her duties. And it maybe made me think, or perhaps one way of interpreting it is that she either continued to have a lot of loyalty among left feminists in the FDMC, or that perhaps the FDMC disapproved of the frankly patronizing language used by the male leadership of the PSP to denounce her as she was expulsed from the party. So just to conclude, we think that she is an important figure, even though we don't have abundant documentation about her, but she helps us rethink the history of feminism in Cuba by including more radical and not just liberal strands, by recovering the role of some Afro-Cuban feminists, and again, the history of global feminism by recentering activists from the global South like Sanchez Mestrapa and the early articulation of intersectional feminism many decades before the second wave feminism of the global North would do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Manuel. So we're open for questions. Questions and comments, please go ahead.
My question in that case, I'll come in quickly and ask both of you, do you have any idea why she has been ignored? I mean, I can see lots of reasons why she should be ignored, as to say, that way you would expect it to be ignored. But can you put your finger on any one that is outstanding, other than the fact that she was expelled from the party, which would make sense after, say, 1960-61? But any other reason?
Manuel, any reasons?
En español.
Sí, yo digo, y en este caso, pues, aunque hable yo, pero voy a citar a Michelle. No, porque digo, pues, al final, pues, Michelle también muestra muy bien en Revolution Within Revolution, ¿no? Que, pues, hay pues, la Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, esta asociación sobre la que hemos estado hablando, pues, queda muy ensombrecida por la creación después de la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, que es una nueva izquierda distinta, ¿no? Que se forja al calor de la insurrección y que no tiene nada que ver con todas estas mujeres de los años 40 y 50 que son las que participan de esta organización. Y prueba de ello es que no solamente Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa, sino también es olvidada Edith García Buchaca, por ejemplo, por todo el caso del caso Marquitos, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, digamos que es todas las mujeres del movimiento revolucionario 26 de julio las que de verdad llegan a ese gran panteón de mujeres ilustres como Vilma Espín, o como pues Melba Hernández o Aide Santa María, ¿no? Entonces, esta puede ser también otra de las razones por las que haya sido olvidada. Pero también creo que hay una cuestión también muy estructural, y es que en general todo el movimiento feminista de la República pues fue olvidado. Se pensó que todo lo que consiguieron las mujeres en Cuba es producto simplemente de la Revolución Cubana y no de los años anteriores. Entonces, creo que también hay una cuestión estructural historiográfica de gran calado que, bueno, pues el libro de Michelle contribuye muchísimo a desvelar, ¿no? y a contestar.
I agree 100% with what he said, and I would just add that it's a shame because there are some really interesting precursors to radical feminism from the Republican period that I think would be helpful for Cubans to know about and to engage with more and to recognize. But yeah, for all the reasons that Manuel has said, I agree.
Elisa has a question. Anybody else, if you put your hand up or just let us know. And Alpha, well, loads of questions coming in. Okay, so Elisa, let's write these down. Elisa, Jean, Alpha, and Anne-Luc. And have I forgotten anybody?
Can we take the questions one after another?
Yeah, so Elisa, do you want to go first?
No, I don't have any questions. Sorry,
okay,
I don't.
Don't worry then. So we've got Jean Stubbs, and then we've got Alpha, and then we've got...
Over to you, Jean.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. I mean, I've long thought, ever since the first work was being done on, I mean, thinking of Lynn Stoner's book, From the House to the Streets, my big question about that book, and when I reviewed it, was, where are the Afro-Cuban women? Because they had to be there. So, I mean, this is wonderful that you've been pursuing this even further than your own work already published, Michelle. You keep saying the Republic. How about the 19th century? How about the participation, which we know about, not necessarily termed in, it's not described as feminism, which is a whole other debate. You know, what do we think of as feminism? But there was clearly a big movement in 19th century Cuba as there was elsewhere. So are you going to take it even further back in time? That's my question.
I think Manuel and I are both really looking forward to the forthcoming work of Takara Brunson, who has really taken some of this work back to the very early, the earliest years of the Republic. And yeah, there's just so much that needs to be done. Yeah, I don't know how much farther back in time I can go, but I think it's really urgent work that needs to be done.
Okay, if Manuel doesn't have anything to add, then we've got Alf.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much, Manuel and Michelle. Very informative. Out of everything that has been said so far, I think I have noticed something: the role of Black people within Cuba. In history, the generals that fought the war with Martí, and also before the revolution. Now, that's important to emphasize that and to make people understand the important role they have played as part of the nation, as part of a unity, as part of an organization. But what I wanted to know is, when she was expelled, was it a unanimous decision? Were there other members who were also white, Black? What did they do? That's very important to know that. I would be very much interested to know. Thank you very much.
We would love to know all of those things too. We don't know. Manuel, do you have any insight, Manuel?
Sí, no, digo, yo un poco se parece a una pregunta que nos hicieron a raíz de, una vez nos revisaron el texto, una de las preguntas que nos hicieron fue precisamente esa, ¿no? Una de las sugerencias. Claro, no, es que no tenemos información de archivo para poder saber qué es lo que sucedió realmente dentro del partido. Pero quizá esto también, lo que sí un poco Michelle pues pudo comprobar es que en realidad también Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa tenía pues relaciones, parece ser sentimentales, con algún miembro del Partido Revolucionario Cubano Auténtico, que bueno, pues en aquel momento era pues enemigo acérrimo, ¿no? del Partido Socialista Popular, y ese puede ser también otro de los factores, pero desde luego algo relacionado con la disciplina tuvo que ver. También hay que tener, yo supongo, en consideración otra cosa, y es que Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa prácticamente estaba a 3 niveles, ¿no? Porque estaba como representante parlamentaria, como integrante del Partido Comunista, como integrante de la Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, iba a las reuniones internacionales, o sea, tenía un activismo desplegado a muchísimos niveles. Entonces igual pues no estaba, para ellos una mujer a tanto nivel quizás no estaba en la posición en la que debía situarse. Pero digo, son puras especulaciones que un poco en el trabajo que hemos escrito Michelle y yo pues se sugieren. Pero no tenemos información de archivo para confirmar qué es lo que pasó con otros integrantes.
I would just add, you know, we talked about that when we went to write this article together. You know, there's some archival documentation that we just don't have, but we felt that it was worthwhile anyway. So, you know, one of the things that I tried to do is just to kind of read between the lines, all of the major leaders of the Communist Party denounced her in writing, right? I mean, there's like entire articles about how bad, what a traitor she was in these publications of the party, which you can read as evidence that she was very important, and they feared her continuing to have influence and power, right? And I do the same thing with that Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, a very limited kind of denunciation of her. It just indicates to me that she continued to have supporters, right? And a friend of mine who has done some research with oral histories that were done with members of the Communist Party in the 1970s. He had access to that. I'm not sure if it was the Consejo de Estado archive, but he said he saw some mentions of her in the 1970s, which was a very institutional time, and when I think it might have been very frowned upon. And some of these people would say, I know she broke with the party, but she was very important. And that indicates to me that her memory was very alive and that she had a lot of support. But it's been hard for us to find any documentation of those things.
Excellent. Thank you, Alf, and thank you for the answers. And Anne, and then if we have time, I might just ask a teensy-weensy question. So, Anne-Lou?
Thanks very much, and thank you for absolutely fascinating paper. I just wanted to ask you really about, I was looking at, for example, the foundation of the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas, and wondering whether you sort of situate Sanchez Matrapa as an exception. So is she sort of unique as a woman of color, as or as a Afro-Cuban early feminist, or do you see her as kind of representative of some kind of movement? And I was wondering, have you chased up the kind of those other founders? Are they like her, or are they from? Is it a different class, different race sort of story with those? Thank you. Thank you.
Manuel, do you want to respond?
Bien, pues gracias por la pregunta. Sí, por ejemplo, Clementina Serra, también que estaba dentro de la organización, de una de las fundadoras, pues igual también. Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa puede ser uno de los casos que podemos rastrear quizás mejor a través de la documentación que hemos podido compilar, pero quizás hay que entenderla más como uno de muchos otros casos que en realidad han sido ignorados por la historiografía. Pero es un caso realmente importante y eso es lo que llama la atención, siendo alguien tan potente que haya sido ignorada. Pero es que debajo, por decirlo de alguna forma, debajo de ella hay muchos otros casos que están empezando a salir a la luz, y creo que la también de Takara Queosa Brusón pues puede ser una gran aportación historiográfica cuando ya se convierta en libro, ¿no? y salga a la luz. Creo que también es importante entender a Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa como un producto de su tiempo, pero también a nivel internacional, porque la misma Tercera Internacional desde los años 20 va hablando de la Negro Question, ¿no? Que dicen, un poco viendo cómo empujar a los países coloniales negros a la emancipación, ¿no? al empoderamiento, ¿no? O sea que es un debate que viene muy de largo, que viene ya desde los comienzos de los años 20 y que a Cuba llega también a través del Partido Comunista, que ya habla en los años 30, y esto lo estudia también Alejandro de la Fe, sobre el cinturón negro de Oriente, ¿no? Como de crear una nación negra independiente dentro de Cuba, ¿no? Entonces, digamos que son debates, y Esperanza Sánchez Mastrapa se forja intelectualmente dentro de estos debates. Entonces, bueno, creo que es un poco de su tiempo, pero es una forma de entender cómo otras mujeres estaban empezando, como ella, mujeres negras y mulatas, empezando a salir del anonimato, ¿no?
I would agree with Manuel, and I would just say that, I have noticed when I look through the magazines of this organization that you see many Afro-Cuban women in the photos, right, of the membership. And she was not the only Afro-Cuban leader. There was also Justina Álvarez, who was an important journalist and who edited for a while the section devoted to women in the Communist Party paper in the 1940s. And after the revolution, Justina Álvarez was basically sort of like demoted. She became like Blas Roca's secretary. And then there was also Maria Argüelles, who was also stayed in the party and continued to be active after the revolution. You sometimes see her in 1959 in newspapers as part of a group affiliated with the Communist Party that was working for racial justice and stuff. So, so some of these women, they were older, though. It was a generation that tended to be older. So some of them couldn't quite make that transition to like leadership positions after 1959. But some of them did stay, and you see them, some of the younger women, Afro-Cuban women who are involved with the Federación Democrática de Mujeres Cubanas. I see them as members of the FMC later and leaders of the FMC later, regional leaders and stuff. So I do think there were other women that just the research hasn't been done.
Thank you very much.
That's fabulous, and I'm going to just use the chair's prerogative, and it's not a question for both of you. It's really, really fascinating paper. Thank you so much. It is just, I don't know, I'm fascinated. Maybe we can carry on this conversation. I'm fascinated if you've looked into the language of her transgression and how racialized and gendered that language of her supposed transgression is, because A, it probably wouldn't happen if it was a man, and B, it happened if she were not black. So I'm just going to leave that there. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, if we could just have a minute's break while I set up our next paper, which is Kenia Santa Herrera, being transported to you from Havana, the Instituto de Historia. She's a colleague of Luis Boffill. A similar topic, la mujer cubana en la lucha contra la guerra, la intervención y el fascismo en los años 30 y 40 del siglo XX. So just bear with me for a second.
La mujer cubana contra la guerra y el fascismo en los años 30 y 40 del pasado siglo XX. Bueno, hay que comenzar diciendo que durante estos años en Cuba van a penetrar las ideas fascistas. Claro, a nivel mundial esto estaba sucediendo, pero en los colegios religiosos y otras organizaciones del país, estas ideas van a falsear la historia, van a omitir el himno nacional por el saludo fascista y van a desplazar a figuras emblemáticas como la de José Martí y otros próceres, y en su lugar van a modelar otras figuras como la de Franco, Mussolini o Hitler. Por ello, estos colegios eran verdaderos focos de formadores de la conciencia juvenil. Ya desde 1932, por decreto de Mussolini, cada nuevo recluta del fascismo recibía en lo adelante una medalla donde iba grabado el rostro de la señorita Yolanda Lavezarri, quien había sido escogida por la impecable belleza de sus facciones para simbolizar el espíritu fascista. Durante la década del 30 en Cuba, se estuvieron dando acciones en favor de la paz y en contra del avance de la guerra y el fascismo, por lo que muchas organizaciones femeninas y mujeres en general se van a organizar en este sentido. Por ello, en junio de 1934, la Unión Radical de Mujeres hace el primer llamamiento público para la constitución del Frente Único de Mujeres contra la Guerra, por lo que se invitaba a todas las mujeres sin distinciones políticas, religiosas ni sociales. Así quedó constituido el 23 de julio de este propio año el Frente Único de Mujeres contra la Guerra, la Intervención y el Fascismo. A esta celebración asistieron representantes de unas 20 organizaciones, entre ellos estudiantes, mecanógrafas, el Partido Comunista, Defensa Obrera Internacional, Sindicato de la Enseñanza, Sindicato de la Aguja y otras tantas. A pocos días, el 1 de agosto de 1934, se logró la realización del Congreso Antibélico que había sido convocado por la Liga Antiimperialista para llevar a las masas populares conocimientos sobre la naturaleza de la guerra y el fascismo. En su mayoría, de los delegados y organizadores de este evento eran mujeres, sobre todo jóvenes. Pero este congreso encontró obstáculos gubernamentales y tuvo que celebrarse a puertas cerradas. Por otro lado, encontramos que el primer congreso antifascista se realiza en México en julio de 1935. Y en él va a estar la doctora Ofelia Domínguez Navarro, conocida feminista revolucionaria cubana de destacada trayectoria para la época. Ya Ofelia, una vez llegado acá a Cuba, bueno, pues va a estar a cargo de la denuncia y la publicidad de las actividades fascistas en Cuba. Ya fuera, esta divulgación va a hacerla a través de las emisoras Radio Sala o CMQ y otras emisoras, donde va a ser una amplia campaña de difusión sobre el peligro de estas nuevas ideologías. Hay que decir que la guerra, por otro lado, la guerra de España, también muy conocida, van a participar casi unos 1000 voluntarios cubanos, y entre estos va a estar la maestra Rosa Pastora Leclerc, que va a estar a cargo de la Casa Escuela Pueblo de Cuba para niños huérfanos extraviados víctimas de la guerra, que ha de sostener la Asociación Cubana de Auxilio al Niño del Pueblo Español. A esta mujer, a esta maestra, se le conoce también como la primera maestra internacionalista cubana. También el avance del fascismo influyó en la programación del Tercer Congreso Nacional ya en 1939. Podemos ver en las promociones de los actos y las convocatorias de estas actividades distintos eslogans como los que les digo a continuación. Por ejemplo, encontramos gran acto contra la guerra imperialista, por Cuba fuera de la guerra imperialista. Y este otro, luchemos unidas como mujeres por la paz en América. Por otro lado, encontramos que en 1942 se crea el Departamento de Propaganda de Guerra de la Defensa Civil del Ministerio de Defensa Nacional. Y al frente va a estar la doctora Ofelia Domínguez, que hace un momento les había comentado. Bueno, ella se encarga desde 1942 hasta 1944 de este departamento y va a desarrollar una intensa labor de difusión hablada y escrita por medio de la radio, la prensa, va a ofrecer charlas, conferencias y otros actos públicos. También va a prepararle el ambiente para el servicio militar obligatorio, el servicio voluntario, las restricciones de guerra, ¿ya? Y la superación física. También estuvo a cargo de la realización de algunos desfiles en la época y Domínguez estuvo a cargo de la responsabilidad del entierro de las víctimas que pudieron ser rescatadas luego de que los barcos de Marina Mercante Santiago de Cuba y Manzanillo fueran hundidos en agosto de 1942 por submarinos nazis. Posteriormente, en 1943, se logra la construcción de un monumento en memoria de estas víctimas en el cementerio Colón. También respondiendo al contexto internacional, en 1942 se crea en Cuba, a semejanza de los Estados Unidos e Inglaterra, el Servicio Femenino de Defensa Civil. Ya este era un organismo de movilización femenina para las tareas auxiliares de la guerra, bajo la jefatura de la doctora María Gómez Carbonell, que para la época era miembro del Senado y del Consejo de Ministros. Atendiendo al llamado junto a cada soldado de la libertad, una mujer trabajando, las cubanas de todas las edades se inscriben voluntariamente para ayudar a ganar la guerra. Entre sus secciones y servicios donde la mujer daba su aporte y pasó al frente, se encontraban los servicios médicos y de enfermería, primeros auxilios, el cuidado de niños y enfermos, servicios domésticos, también otros servicios específicos de guerra, como manejo de ambulancia, servicios de administración, vigilancia nocturna, sección de propaganda, entre otras. Concluida la guerra, Ofelia Domínguez, ya siendo secretaria general de la Asociación Cubana de Naciones Unidas en 1947, hace un llamamiento al país en favor de los niños de las áreas devastadas de la guerra y logran recaudar a lo largo de todo el país una suma, con lo cual pueden enviar 2 barcos cargados de azúcar a Europa. Esta recaudación también fue posible gracias a los aportes de los niños de las escuelas públicas del país. Entonces, de manera general, podemos decir que se aprecia a la mujer cubana en los años 30 y 40 desempeñándose no solo en las cuestiones teóricas, sino prácticas también respecto al auge de la guerra y el fascismo. Desde el uso de la palabra educan, incentivan y despiertan la conciencia nacional, alertando sobre los peligros de dichos fenómenos. Se trabaja desde la trinchera, desde la tribuna y desde la labor ideológica con discursos, mítines, divulgación de propagandas, conferencias, congresos, etc. Desde la acción, bueno, pues recaudan fondos a lo largo de toda la República, gestionan el envío de municiones alimenticias y de vestuario, movilizan las masas para determinadas acciones, dan protección y auxilio, se alistan en el servicio voluntario, se capacitan en las disímiles tareas, entre otras actividades. También se manifiesta su desempeño en actividades internacionalistas. Bien, fomentando la unidad y la cooperación colectiva. Y la protección del niño fue uno de los puntos esenciales de la agenda de trabajo de estas mujeres. Bueno, hasta aquí mi ponencia para ajustarme al tiempo. Les deseo buen día a todos y espero que haya sido de interés la intervención.
Okay, so a reminder that Luis Boffill's presentation on El Almendrón, Kenya, Herrera's presentation that you've just heard, the materials are available. If you'd like to have a correspondence with them, we have their WhatsApp numbers, they may be the easiest way of doing things. They're sending us WhatsApps right now as their presentations are being reproduced for you. So we're doing our best to keep Cuba involved on that side.
Okay, well, we divided this into 2 sections, antes and después. Antes, by beautiful coincidence, were 2 papers about women on the left, which we hadn't anticipated, but that was a perfect combination. And we now move on to 2 other papers for the después part, which again have something in common, which is the question of race. Marisa Wilson, Elisa Botella Rodriguez, first of all, about the question of whether there are no black farmers in Cuba, exclamation mark, a quote. And then Rodrigo Espina from Cuba, once again a recording for his research on the race debate. Okay.
Excellent.
Over to you, Marisa and Elisa.
Okay. Hello. Good morning to those in Cuba and good afternoon. or in the US. Good afternoon to all of us here. I'm delighted to give this talk with my colleague at University of Salamanca, Elisa. And this talk, let's see, I'm new to this, so it's very much a work in progress. We're very much developing our ideas and finding sources at this stage, so we're really grateful for anyone to give us your feedback, or if you see that we have any gaps in our thinking, then do let us know in any sources that you feel like we need to read. But also we're thinking about collaborating with possible colleagues in Cuba or the UK. So if you're interested in this, then do let us know. The paper responds, we aim to respond to and challenge scholarly silences, including in our own work, regarding the role of race and racialization in Marxist understandings of agrarian change. Now, this was inspired by conversations I've had with colleagues at the University of the West Indies, particularly Patricia Northover, and at Duke University, Mikaeline Krishlo, whose work has really inspired my thinking around this and are trying to get our heads around this topic. So with that, I will pass it over to Elisa. I don't see her picture, but hopefully she's with us.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Marisa. I'm really glad to be here with Marisa presenting this work in progress, as she just mentioned. And this is a working paper we are trying to build with the starting point of building a conversation between the old and the new agrarian questions in Cuba. Considering that the old agrarian question deals with class differentiation and capital, but what about other dimensions or other forms of social differentiation? And here we would like to talk about race, gender, ethnicity. We realize that the role in the transformation of the peasantry under the old agrarian question does not take into account other forms of social differentiation that we are gonna consider in this working paper. Then we move to slide 5, please.
I've done so.
Okay, thank you, Marisa. Within this simplification of social relations to capital and class under the old agrarian question, we move to Cuba, because in the case of Cuba, the achievements of the revolution to improve racial inequality were significant. However, and this is something we were talking about in previous papers and in previous sections this morning and also yesterday, what about Black farmers and their dispossession from land before and after the revolution, and even after the special period and after the global food crisis in 2007, 2008? Are there racial differences between Eastern and Western provinces? We find that there is a need to connect these old and new agrarian questions in Cuba, including the racial dimension. This also implies a revision of histories of migration, of Black labor, histories of enslavement in Cuba, and even some of the questions raised yesterday by Loredana, for example, when she talks about immigrants from Haiti and Jamaica, and to what extent they were considered or not citizens in Cuba. Basically, diverging experiences of Afro-Caribbean immigrants, workers in Cuba in the early 20th century. Then we move to slide 6. And this is the new agrarian question that deals with capital and class, but also the problems on neoliberal development and the opportunities and problems peasants face in this neoliberal context. This means that the new agrarian question considers multiple ways to understand the peasant condition and the struggle for land, including ethnicity, gender, ecological dimensions, something we also So during the documentary, which is pretty significant nowadays in Cuba when talking about the different dimensions of the documentary, I mean, it is this new agrarian question, it is a more holistic view with multiple intersections. Then we move to slide 7, please. Considering that Via Campesina is the best example of transnational peasant movements that rise from below in the struggle for land within these new agrarian questions, and shows these intersections between the different dimensions of the new agrarian question, in particular the relation between Via Campesina and ANAP, la Asociación Nacional de Agricultores Pequeños in Cuba, which has coordinated this Via Campesina International Labor Commission on Sustainable Peasant Agriculture. Therefore, when analyzing the new agrarian question in Cuba, we need to consider these intersections, as I said before, not only between Via Campesina and ANAP, la Asociación Nacional de Agricultores Pequeños, but also the Cuban state. I mean, this should be explored. And mainly in the light of a celebrated or well-known land reform based on this delivery of usufruct land from 2008 to 2018, in order to understand to what extent these alliances are really inclusive. We move then to slide 8, please.
Sorry, I've done that. Go ahead, though.
Okay, thank you, Marisa. So we should go further and provide an in-depth understanding of the role of ANAP, the political and ideological alliances between Cuban peasants and the state, and to what extent these alliances, this cooperation, these coordination actions exclude landless blacks. I mean, we need to take into account these alliances when exploring the new agrarian question in Cuba. In other words, and this is what Marisa is going to explain in the following parts, in the following slides of the presentations, have black farmers benefited from well-known celebrated land reform? So Marisa, to follow.
Okay, so then the next section here of this talk, this quote, "There are no black farmers in Cuba," comes from one of my research participants when I did research about a decade ago in Cuba. And I regret to say that I didn't pursue this as a research topic. And in fact, so it's a silence that really needs to be overcome. And so when we look into some of the preliminary research that we've done, we can see that there is some indication from 2007 of the great disparities between land ownership between blacks and white farmers. And unfortunately, Esteban Morales Rodriguez doesn't have any, we can't find any information that's beyond 2007, which is unfortunate because there's decree laws in 2008, 2012, and 2018, which redistributed lands to lots of farmers. And Cuba went from 15% of lands owned by private farmers in 1992 to 40% of land owned by private farmers, or usufructarios, who aren't entirely private in the sense that we know it. So in 2017, 40% was usufructarios. But the question that Mesolago asks here in 2016 is, who are these farmers? There needs to be research about what's going on the ground and who's actually getting the land. So we've seen that racial inequality is a great problem in Cuba. Emily Morris was talking about other problems, said that this is monitoring and progress are happening. They are happening in regards to racial inequalities in Cuba as well. But there's been quite a lot of work on economic inequalities that have happened since the special period, particularly in regards to remittances coming from the US that are usually benefiting white Cubans, because it's white Cubans who are able to leave Cuba. but also inequalities in opportunities for employment in the tourist sector and the hard currency economy. But actually, peasants are a privileged class, if you will. They're a privileged group of people in Cuba. They're privileged for many reasons, which we can talk about. And Carmen Deer's work was really good to indicate this in 1992, but I realize I have to move on quickly here. Yes, there's need for research, there's need for affirmative action, I think, to redress this. I put in California's Farm Equity Act of 2018, which is really interesting because they're redistributing lands to farmers of color. So this final section is just thinking about understanding agrarian change in a more inclusive way and overcoming the silences in our research and other forms of research. But this relates to the old agrarian question in the sense that we need to think more about racialized differentiations and how these might intersect with class differentiations, or in other words, the difference between how capitalism or how outside influences create rich and poor farmers or even exclude farmers from owning land. Well, how does that work in terms of class and also gender? And my colleagues again at UE and then Duke University have really started to look at these questions. There's also gaps in understanding the new agrarian question, which isn't, ironically, maybe not radical enough when it comes to thinking about political and ideological alliances between states and peasants and how these might hinder goals of inclusivity. I've been really inspired by the work of Satnam Virdi, who's at University of Glasgow, thinking about historical sociologies and how the significance really of racism in the making of modernity, and the fact that the ways that we think about history, and this is again has come in the earlier papers in this panel and other papers, really is quite Eurocentric, and we need to understand it as such and actually start to work towards filling in the gaps. So one question, a few questions that we have are, what kinds of pre-revolutionary precedents for land distribution are reflected in this land reform that in many respects has been seen in the literature as very progressive and celebrated? How have racial differentiations in the countryside, how have they occurred in the past, and how do these processes continue, or do they continue in the present?
A couple of minutes left.
Okay, so I'll pass you to Elisa, and then we'll be finishing up.
Thank you, Marisa. In this context, we recognize that our previous research agendas never deal with race in Cuba's process of representation. And this is also the case of other scholars, experts in Cuba's agriculture, as mentioned below, the case of Roset, Funes Monzote, Armando Nova. They never focus or they never related the peasantry and racial differentiation. As Marisa already mentions, Mesa Lago even pointed to this lack of information on racial differentiation in Voces de Cambio en el Sector No Estatal Cubano when doing interviews to usufructuarios. And we really believe that this problem needs to be tackled in our future research agenda, and therefore, considering this gap in the literature, we rectify in our present work and start building, as I said before, a more inclusive research agenda on Cuba's agrarian change and representation. We look forward to finding, as Marisa already said, Cuban partners, specialists, qualitative and quantitative data to help us to understand this research. We really thank your attention, and comments and feedback are very welcome. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks to both of you. We actually have now about 5 minutes or so for questions, so I open up to anybody to ask away. Any questions? All right, Jean, over to you.
Marisa, you might just want to stop sharing the screen so that we can see people's faces.
Oh, okay. How do I close
so
the
right at the top, there's a box right on the right. There's a box with an arrow going into it or a cross on it. If it's a cross, you need to click it and it'll go back to a normal view. Can you see that? A box with a cross at the bottom. No, we can't do it because she's controlling.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Jean, do you want to go ahead and ask a question? Meanwhile.
Yeah, I can ask the question. Actually, I could see Marisa before you asked her to turn the screen off.
I was misunderstanding, but yes.
Yeah, I can see you now at the bottom, even though.
Stop presenting.
Okay,
there
you
go.
Marisa.
There you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we can see you. Yeah, sorry to be me to pitch in again, but these are topics that I've worked on a lot. So, as I'm thinking about this, one thing is land ownership, and another thing is who is working the land, right? So it's not that there are no Black people farming the land, it's the question of land ownership. And then it gets even more complicated because just as before the revolution, you had the sharecropping and you had the rent, the subletting, and all the complications of the way in which land was structured and farming was structured. You have that replicated in the revolutionary period, which people don't quite like to talk about very much. And I remember back in I think it was the early 80s, I mentioned the word sharecropping in the context of the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And the response from the Cubans was up in arms, what do you mean sharecropping in Cuba? I said, well, how else do you describe, and this is tobacco, of course, which I know I can't speak for other crops. How else do you describe an arrangement between the peasant farmer, the smallholder, and giving part of the land to someone who's living on the land? You give a little bit, they have a little shack or whatever, and they're farming it and they're giving you some of the crop. There's no other way of describing that, really. So my suggestion would be, this is excellent work, but you're going to have to go deeper than just the land ownership question.
Yes,
and the same would hold for gender as well as race. Mm-hmm. People will equally say, there are no women farmers in Cuba. Well, give me a break. The amount of work that the women do within the small peasant household, and not only the household as in the home, but whether it's the livestock or the crop and the children. Mm-hmm. You are looking at a family economy. So it's ripe for an amazing amount of research. So thank you for taking this on.
Thank you.
Lisa, do you want to respond?
Well, probably we will need a lecture in order to explain, as you already know, the agrarian structure in Cuba, which is quite complicated before and after the revolution, and how is nowadays organized, with these cooperatives and cooperativas de crédito y servicio, las CPA. It's very complicated, but I really thank your comment, and this is something we really need to clarify in our research. Obviously, here we didn't have time to make a clear differentiation between a parceria, basically sharecropping, who owns the land and who is working the land. So we really need to define who are usufructuarios, and who are private owners. And this is something I already done in my previous work, but here we didn't have time, we didn't have a space. And I really thank your comment, because I think it is always the same problem. We need basically 20-30 minutes to explain how the Cuba's agrarian structure is organized, because it's completely crazy. Thanks a lot. Marisa, I don't know.
Well, maybe since we don't have much time, but thanks for that comment for sure. I think gender needs to be in there, and we haven't dealt with that at all here. So that's a big problem. And it reminds me of, when I was in Cuba working with some farmers, where I wanted to do participant observation. I wanted to do the farming and they wouldn't allow me to. They just wanted me to sit there and have a photo of me doing the work, but actually not working the farm at all. So it's just me just pretending to work. But I think there's a lot of things going on in terms of what kinds of work, different, and the gender differentiations of what kinds of work are considered appropriate as well.
Okay, so So thank you, Jean, thank you both of you for answering that. We have potentially 3 more questions. So William had his hand up first, although he doesn't seem to be here, maybe he is. And then Alf, and then Michelle. William, Alf, Michelle. Can try and keep them a little bit brief because we're going to have to try and hit our break on time.
Hello, Pa, is that me, William?
That is you, William. Your hand was up.
Hello, Marisa. Hello, Elisa. Just a quick question, Marisa. This is something that you and I talked about years and years and years ago in relation to agriculture in Cuba. Would you imagine that these racial lines that are running through the agricultural system and it's all its complexity, and I think Jean's question is really appropriate there to think about actually, you know, what's the difference between land ownership and land stewardship in any respect? But do you think this might be a bit of a sort of an unseen shadow on what is very often touted as this wonderful agricultural revolution from the special period onwards? Do you think this is one of those sort of unseen or slightly hidden aspects of it, that it still manifests some racial and, as Jean said, gender, although I've not focused on that at all, but do you think that there are these racial lines which are slightly sort of underspoken about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think that's the point is that we're trying to make, William, is that, and it's a similar point to some of the others' papers, is that there's these silences and we don't really know, except it seems to, you know, just the 2007 data from Esteban Morales, which was actually a state-sanctioned study, suggests that there's very big inequalities here that are not really being discussed. And the main thing is the research that celebrates repeasantization and the land reforms that are recent. We can celebrate, but we also need to pay attention to these injustices, particularly because the population is 70% Black, you know, Afro-Cubans, and this is a big injustice just to ignore it altogether. So that's kind of where we're coming from, but it's really just the beginnings, and I wish I had loads of time to work on this, but we are just gently moving into this as a working paper to start with, and then we'll see where we go with it. But you're welcome to join us.
I'd love to. We'll talk on another occasion, Marisa.
Yeah, absolutely.
May I just quickly follow up with one quick comment? I'll be very brief, and that is, I wonder, bearing in mind our conversation of yesterday on the SDGs, I wonder if this is one of the failings within the 17, you know, this is in terms of gender inequality and racial inequality, both of which are separate SDGs. I wonder if, I haven't gone to check, but I wonder if this is highlighted in the self-reports that the state provides on an annual basis to the UN. It'd be interesting to see. And in fact, Emily mentioned the SACS sort of independent report on the fulfilling of SDGs, and obviously the arbitrariness of that. But I wonder if these inequalities feature in there as well. I haven't gone to look.
Well, that's a good question. Sorry, Lisa.
Thank you, William. Sorry, we are just going to try and
Yeah, that's me done. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So, Alf, try and keep it as brief as you can, and Michelle.
Yeah. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Elisa, for your paper. I was just wondering whether, don't you think that this is due to historical fact, that the fact that Blacks didn't own the land during the whole 19th century to today? But also, don't you think that what is more important is the representation of unionized Black members within the CTC and within other organizations to defend their moral right as Cubans, participating in the development of the country, but within the unions? Don't you think that an emphasis can be expanded to bring in the unions? And in the CTC, I know that there are many Black people who have got responsible posts within the union, and I think, you know, you can put that aspect into it as well and see how that can influence their defending their moral and material interests as well as political right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alf. And Michelle.
I'll also be very brief. Congratulations. I think that this is a really great project. And I've also heard many people say in Cuba, just casually, that there's no black farmers, that all the landowners are white, etc. So I'd love to know the roots of that and how you're going to explain it. I just wanted to really briefly plug the dissertation of a woman that I know at NYU who's finishing up, Sarah Cosime. She's already begun to publish. She's rethinking the whole agrarian reform, but especially the earliest years. And a couple of the articles that she's published, I'm happy to send you the refs. One of them suggests that Black agrarian activists were very important in helping the 26th of July movement think about and conceptualize their agrarian reform. Although if that's true, that it might be sort of ironic with, you know, some of the results that you're pointing out. But I think another thing that maybe one of the takeaways that she's finding in her dissertation is that people often think there was this very brief period in time in, you know, 1960 when there was a move towards small farms. And then very quickly there was a move towards collectivization and just start farms and people receiving some kind of wage. And I think one of the things she's trying to show is actually this period of redistribution of land and the creation of a class of small private farmers went on much longer than people know and involved many more people and was just, you know, a much more important period of reform. So it'd be interesting to know what the impact of that early, trend in thinking of the revolutionaries, the revolution's agrarian reform, what impact that had, and not just to assume that there was some kind of continuity between before 1959 and land ownership patterns afterwards.
Oh, great.
I hope you guys can be in touch with her.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Lucely. It would be lovely. Thank you.
So she's actually on this list. Sarita, she's on the list. She was hoping to attend today. I can't see her initials here, but we are recording. She'll find out about you. You can also email us. Look at the list of participants. You can contact directly.
Can I just quickly respond to Alpha? Thank you, Michelle. That's brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much. Just in terms of the early 20th century, going before Antes, we're just delving into this, but Jorge, the paper by Luis Perez, the 1986 paper on the 1912 race war, when he talks about, there were, and it really depends on what you mean by ownership, but there were farmers that were working the land and that owned, quote unquote, the land, but it was taken away from them because they didn't have the paperwork. And this happens across the world. But I think the idea is looking into those kinds of dispossessions from the period of slavery and then what happened after that, and to try to link it up. But it's a big project. So we have to find a way in to start with just a paper and hopefully collaborators. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Alf, and thanks both of our speakers. Miriam, I can see that you've got your hand raised. Could I ask that you leave your question until the break? Because otherwise we're just going to get so behind ourselves. Is that okay? I'm assuming it's a yes. I'm being a little bit authoritarian at this stage. So, Tony's going to introduce the next paper. I'm going to line it up. It's another one from Cuba. It is our friend Rodrigo Espina Prieto. So, Tony, you introduce.
Yes, Rodrigo Espina Prieto is, of course, a stalwart of the forum because he has coordinated the last two events in Havana, last year and 2 years before that. And we hope we'll be coordinating next year's as well. And he's done a lot of work. His race is his big topic, and he has done a lot of work on that. So he has recorded his 10 minutes, and he is normally very good at this sort of thing. So it will be 10 minutes, we hope.
Right. Before we do that, because he is a friend of the Cuba Research Forum and he's been to Nottingham, he's attended, he wanted to send you all and us all a nota previa. So I'm going to read it in the style of Rodrigo. Let's see how that goes. Muy buenos días. Diría desde Cuba, muy buenas tardes en el Reino Unido para todos los participantes. Ante todo, un saludo y agradecimiento a mis amigos Par y Tony por la invitación y posibilidad. Agradezco asimismo la presencia de la Embajadora de Cuba en el Reino Unido, Bárbara Montalvo, y de otros funcionarios del Estado cubano. ¿Qué momento nos estamos perdiendo los cubanos que no estamos allá? Bueno, la magia revolucionaria de Par y Tony. Un saludo a los amigos cubanos y de otros países, en particular a Jorge Núñez Jovet y a Arnold August, Emily Morris, Isabel Story, Miriam Palacios Calendar y Luke. Saludos y agradecimientos a todos. La ponencia que leeré es un resumen del documento enviado previamente. Paso a leerla directamente en virtud del tiempo, la extensión y del peso del documento para que logre pasar por mi WhatsApp. Gracias. Okay, so I'm going to just come back so I can open up the next document, which is his audio and his paper.
Activismo antirracial en Cuba desde los años 90 a la actualidad. La creación de organizaciones de diferente tipo por los afrodescendientes es un fenómeno histórico. Ejemplo de esto pueden ser los cabildos, surgidos desde los inicios del siglo XIX. Pero en esta ponencia no haremos referencia a aspectos de carácter histórico. Siempre hablaremos desde una mirada contemporánea, que en este caso parte de finales de los años 90. Aunque siempre ha habido intentos por crear organizaciones que tienden al activismo antirracial, a partir de los finales de los 90 es que comienzan a surgir un grupo relativamente numeroso en la sociedad cubana. En el año 98 se crea la Cofradía de la Negritud, posiblemente la primera de las organizaciones antirracistas de la sociedad civil cubana en este periodo. Posteriormente, en el 2001, se crea en la Unión de Escritores y Artistas de Cuba, UNIAD, el proyecto Color Cubano, espacio de debate sobre la temática racial que logró aunar entre sus participantes a altas figuras de la política, el arte y la academia cubana, junto a pueblo en general, con constancia y regularidad hasta su culminación en el 2009. Entonces, en la segunda década de los años 2000, comienza un proceso nunca visto en el periodo revolucionario, posterior al 59. La creación de un conjunto de organizaciones, asociaciones, proyectos comunitarios, culturales, plataformas, blogs, boletines, grupos de profesionales, emprendimientos, cuyo objetivo es la lucha antirracista desde sus diferentes posibilidades, espacios, contextos, objetivos, estilos, capacidades, potencialidades, algunos con relaciones estrechas o bajo el paraguas de organismos estatales, otros no, casi ninguno reconocido en el registro de asociaciones del Ministerio de Justicia. La inmensa mayoría no ha solicitado este ingreso o no lo necesita por el tipo de organización que es, o sin vínculo que lo ampare. Algunos de ellos con capacidades de relaciones internacionales o pertenecientes a redes regionales. La mayoría, para mí, la inmensa mayoría, con signo, una mirada positiva en cuanto a logros generales de la revolución, algunos no, pero también con una mirada crítica hacia lo que no se ha logrado en relación con el racismo, el prejuicio y la discriminación raciales. En estos momentos, al menos en el occidente del país, La Habana, Matanzas, provincias centrales, algunas de Santiago, de Cuba, hemos podido identificar cerca de 60 espacios, nombre genérico que empleo por el momento, por la amplia y difusa tipología que presentan y que habría que estudiar y diferenciar muy bien. Aconsejo leer el directorio adjunto que envié. Aunque entre la mayoría de estos espacios de activismo antirracial existe conocimiento mutuo y cierta sinergia, no puede asegurarse que tengan aún una agenda común en general. Quizás no puedan ni aspiren. Algunos de ellos han logrado una relación más estrecha entre sí, como sucede con la Red Barrial Afrodescendiente o con Afrocubanas y otros proyectos culturales, ahora adscritos muchos de ellos, buscando un mayor reconocimiento y diálogo a la Comisión Apuntes de la Unidad, la cual tiene esa vocación de crear sinergias. Este proceso inédito en la sociedad cubana actual, de creación, existencia, permanencia, de alianzas y sinergias tímidas aún, de transaccionalidad, de visibilidad cada vez mayor por el resto de la población, de suma de esfuerzos y personas, tendrá que producir frutos en virtud de los objetivos comunes que se planteen. Ahora nos referiremos al Programa Nacional contra el Racismo y la Discriminación Racial. Este programa se presentó y aprobó en el Consejo de Ministros el 20 de noviembre del 2019. Fue publicado en la prensa. Como estructura central, se creó una comisión gubernamental presidida por el propio presidente Díaz-Canel, quien venía atendiendo directamente esta problemática desde el 2011, cuando era vicepresidente primero. Esta comisión, integrada por 18 entidades estatales y otras tantas de la sociedad civil, hasta un total de 41 miembros, abarca un espectro relativamente amplio de los organismos del Estado o directamente relacionados con este. De la coordinación interna está responsabilizado por encargo presidencial el Ministerio de Cultura. Estos datos ilustran sobre la importancia que le asigna el Partido Comunista de Cuba y el Estado cubano a este programa. Se presupone que el programa articule con los lineamientos de la política económica y social, la conceptualización del modelo económico y social cubano y el plan de desarrollo económico y social hasta el 2030, documentos rectores actuales de la política cubana, y responda además a los principios que sustentan nuestra relativamente reciente Carta Magna. El programa y la sociedad civil es el último aspecto por tratar. El Programa Nacional contra Racismo y Discriminación Racial tiene que enfrentarse al problema que Fidel calificó, y cito, desgraciadamente, como uno de los más complejos y más difíciles de los que la revolución tiene que abordar. Las dificultades para esta complejidad son de orden tanto objetivo como subjetivo. Estas últimas las más difíciles de vencer. Los casi 61 años de revolución transcurridos han demostrado este acerto de Fidel. Por algo, él dice en su frase una palabra que, al menos en mi memoria, pocas veces le oí mencionar en sus discursos, cargados de optimismo, de soluciones, de proactividad, de victorias. Esa palabra es desgraciadamente, lo que implica, según mi criterio, la inmensa tarea que él veía por delante al enfrentar este problema, lo que nunca impidió, por el contrario, asumir el desafío por su parte. El programa, que resulta muy necesario a criterios de la inmensa mayoría de los entrevistados telefónicamente y por WhatsApp durante la pandemia, ha sido calificado por la mayoría de ellos también como demorado en su llegada y lento en su accionar. Es un programa, claro, que se ha visto impedido de avanzar más, como era su objetivo de su fundación, por la pandemia, que ha limitado la acción, si no de su estructura fundamental, sí de sus posibles relaciones con la base, entre otros pasos previstos. Sin embargo, en estas condiciones pandémicas, el tema se ha presentado vigoroso en las redes sociales. Aunque aisladas unas de otras, no han podido crear sinergias entre ellas. Así, si el reto general del programa es inmenso, el reto particular de la existencia de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil es particularmente fuerte. Pues para muchos de estos activistas o líderes de proyectos, el programa puede resultar un obstáculo para el desarrollo de sus empeños particulares, que en ocasiones se limita a un ámbito comunitario en el que él se siente exitoso por poder perder el protagonismo, por no coincidir en sus objetivos, aunque los del programa pueden ser más generales y amplios, o precisamente por esta misma razón. Otros pensarán que no les es preciso, pues tienen cubiertas sus necesidades desde el punto de vista personológico o de liderazgo. Este es posiblemente el reto inmediato mayor para el programa, lograr una participación de todo el pueblo, sumados en un empeño común, en un debate y accionar que no ha esperado por nadie, debate que nos ha incluido a todos y ha sido generado por todos, no importa nuestro color de la piel ni qué lugar ocupemos en la sociedad. En otras ponencias he hablado del inmenso aporte en el plano nacional e internacional que Cuba ha realizado en la lucha contra las desigualdades sociales, contra el racismo, en fin, por la vida. Recuérdese la brigada Henry Reef. Sin embargo, tenemos deudas sociales que muchas pasan por el plano económico con fuerte incidencia en el plano subjetivo, educativo, cultural, que dificultan el total desempeño exitoso de nuestros esfuerzos en diversos campos. Estimo que si se realiza un buen trabajo, si los objetivos no se desvían por el camino, está empeñada la palabra del presidente, quien ha demostrado ser un hombre de paciencia y firmeza en sus criterios y fines. Este programa puede contribuir una vez más en la Revolución Cubana, como quería Martí, a alcanzar toda la justicia. Muchas gracias.
Okay, we are back. So, we have reached 3:30 por alguna magia revolucionaria. We're bang on time again. Please, if you do want to make comments, if you want to take time to read Rodrigo's paper, there's a bibliography there as well. Please do feel free again to send your comments either on here in the chat or we can send them by WhatsApp to him. But let's take a break. So we will be back at 4 for our last two panels of the conference. Panel 7, Cuba in the United States, Cuba in the United States, and panel 8, health, well-being, and COVID. So let's go get